I'm Susan Scott, independent consultant in scientific publication management, clinical trial disclosure. Priya has already talked about the FDA final rule. I'll be talking about the European clinical trial regulations and also EMA Policy 070. And I'll be giving some personal thoughts about implications and recommendations towards the end. So, first of all, the principles of the European clinical trial regulation. These 4 points are actually taken off the European clinical trial regulation website. The main purpose was to have a harmonised electronic submission and assessment process for clinical trials across all member states. In the past, each clinical trial had to make applications to whichever countries they were going to conduct that in. And so that was quite labour intensive. So what they've done is to have a single electronic submission that goes to all the member states that are going to take part in that study, and also to one single ethics committee as well. And so that will give improved collaboration, information sharing and decision making between those member states. And obviously they have to say that provide the highest standards of safety for all participants in European clinical trials, and to give increased transparency of information on clinical trials. And essentially the whole thing is to try and make Europe a more attractive place for doing clinical trials in future. Now, as far as publication and disclosure people are concerned, this bit, the increased transparency of information on clinical trials, is what we're most interested in. But I thought it would be useful to understand the whole purpose of the new regulation. That replaces the previous European Clinical Trial Directive, which was country by country. This new clinical trial regulation was issued in April 2014, but the full implementation is dependent on the new European portal and database, and they're in development, and they're delayed due to IT system difficulties. But you can imagine that it's actually a pretty complex computer system to put together across all the member states, the ethics committees, the sponsors, making many parts of it available to the public. So you can see that it's actually quite a complex system. So I do have some sympathy with them. The latest estimate that they came up with was that the new portal and database would be available by the second half of 2019. It has moved consistently over the last 2 or 3 years. But nevertheless, the clinical trials are currently being registered on clinicaltrialsregister.eu, and clinical trial results are being posted on the EudraCT database. The new clinical trial regulation applies to all clinical trials conducted in Europe, and they define clinical trials quite carefully as any prospective assignment of a subject to a therapeutic strategy which is outside the normal clinical practice. And essentially, that's all clinical studies where there's all clinical trials where there's prospective assignment, but it does not include non-interventional studies. The sponsor of the trial submits the clinical trial application dossier through the EU portal, or will do when it's built, and that is then distributed to member states and ethics committees, and there is communication between that EU portal between the member states and the ethics committees. That communication will remain confidential, and also any personal identifying data or commercially confidential data. The remainder, most of the the clinical trial application will become publicly accessible after the decision about the clinical trial, but the sponsor can defer public release by different periods depending on the development phase of the clinical trial that they're applying for. So if it's phase 1, you can apply to have it to have this information on the protocol and the investigator brochure, etc., deferred for 7 years after the end of the clinical trial or until marketing authorization. Phase 2 and 3, it's a 5-year time frame. If it's a phase 4 study, so in other words, the product is already licensed, then it's 12 months after the end of the clinical trial. So they're some quite complicated rules. They have an appendix or an annex which specify exactly what clinical trial results will be posted within 1 year of the clinical trial end. And these are the points: general trial information, objectives, design, rationale, subject population, etc., etc. Subject disposition, baseline characteristics, endpoints, adverse events, substantial modifications, interruptions, limitations. And interestingly, if you prospectively plan to do an intermediate data analysis, you have to post the results of that as well, 1 year after the end of that that intermediate data analysis. And at the same time, you need to post the layperson summary of clinical trial results, so at the same time as the clinical trial results summary. We're going to be discussing this a bit more later. The EMA Policy070, which is a document that runs alongside, applies to centrally authorised products only. And so far, the first phase has been implemented. But essentially, they are making public any clinical overviews, clinical summaries, clinical study reports, and their appendices, so protocols and amendments, samples, CRFs, and statistics methods. And these documents are redacted for commercially confidential information and anonymised for any personal identifying information. And it's for any reports that are in marketing authorisations submitted after the beginning of January 2015, or any line extensions after July 2015. And it includes rejected or withdrawn applications as well as approved applications. And the data appears on this website, clinicaldata.ema. They started, as you can see, it was for reports in marketing authorisations submitted after the 1st of January, and they got a huge backlog pretty quickly. So the first reports were not published until October 2016. So there was a press release that came out 20th of October 17 saying that they'd managed to put on the public database clinical reports from 50 products, and that's more than 300 documents and 1.3 million pages in that first year. And I know that they still have a backlog behind them. I have had a good look at some of the documents, and there's been very little redacted considered as commercially confidential. There's quite a lot taken out for personal identifiers, but very little. The EMA consider very little data to be commercially confidential. There is a second phase in EMA Policy070, which is to publish or make available individual patient data in an anonymised fashion. At the moment, there are no details of that, and they have said that they will. That's delayed until phase 1 is fully implemented. Of course, some companies are already making that available independently through clinicalstudyresults.com, but under the EMA, it's not yet been, there have been no guidelines issued, and it's not yet implemented. So, I'll try and give you an overview from my perspective of where we stand in terms of data transparency. This is a schematic of a clinical trial from the first patient, the first visit, to the end of trial or the primary completion date, then the database lock, tables, listings and figures, final clinical trial report, and marketing authorization or withdrawal. As you know, the trial appears first of all before the first patient first visit, both on the European Clinical Trial Register, which is drawn from the clinical trial application information, and on clinicaltrials.gov. You might well have a protocol or an unmet need Congress abstract, which you do while the study's underway. But then 12 months after the end of the trial or the primary completion date, the summary results appear on clinicaltrials.gov and the European Clinical Trial Register. And if it's a study in children, then it's 6 months after the end of the clinical trial in Europe. You may well be having a top-line results Congress abstract and poster or talk at this similar sort of time, and perhaps working on your primary manuscript and getting that through as well. Lay summaries at the moment are optional. Some companies are certainly doing that at present. The redacted full clinical trial reports are now mandatory in Europe for centrally authorised products when they've been licensed. And individual patient data is still at present optional. And so that's my sort of assessment of where we stand now. If I go on to, once the European Clinical Trial Regulation comes into full force, we still have the summary results on clinicaltrials.gov and the European Clinical Trial Register, and we still have the redacted full clinical trial reports. But we will have protocols, amendments and statistical analysis plan in the US 12 months after the clinical trial end, and also the investigator brochure, the IMPD, the investigational medicine product, something or other, anyway, the chemistry side of things behind it, they will become available, as I explained before, at different time points, depending on whether they're phase 1, 2 and 3 or phase 4. The lay summaries will become required 12 months after the end of the clinical trial in Europe, not optional and later anymore. And individual patient data will also be required in Europe, but the timeline is to be confirmed on that. We don't know quite how that's going to work. So this is my feeling of how it's going to look from 2020. So in my view, there's a big change of mindset. You know, we have to take our heads out of the sand and accept that all trial documents are going to become public. So you might as well start right at the beginning, right when you start designing protocols and writing protocols, knowing full well that everything is going to become public. So don't put more in than you have to, because otherwise you'll have problems later. That's fine for prospective trials starting now, but I think that the issue is for those studies that have been going for a few years and trying to manage the changeover. And I would say to this audience in particular, who tend to be publication specialists, that publications are only one of many clinical trial disclosures now. Once upon a time, it was the Congress abstracts and posters and the manuscripts, and there was really very little else that went out to the public. There's now an absolute plethora of information going out. So publications is just one of them. And so clinical trial disclosure, you know, there's the protocol, the results summary, the full clinical trial report, the Congress abstract or poster, the manuscript, the layperson summary, and there are all these different sites as well, the regulatory database, the company or trial website, the Congress, the journal. And then you have a sort of, what I would call a trial spaghetti, really, of what goes where. So I think it's essential that you have not just a publication team and a publication plan, but that you have an integrated disclosure team and plan. And you need to think through what documents are going to be disclosed. Again, not just the publications and the Congress material, but also the protocol, the investigator brochure, the informed consent, the stats analysis plan, the results summary, etc., etc. And also think about plan which of these need redaction or anonymisation. So your stats people and your data people are going to be really helpful. And you can't go to them 2 weeks before you need to release it. They need to be brought into the planning. And then on the other side of that, obviously, looking at what are your intended disclosure outlets and what goes to where and when. And that's the first time I've actually mentioned press releases as well, but they need to be factored into the whole thing. Looking at the data source and timing and where the last subject, last visit, final tables, figures and listings, final clinical trial report, and all your reporting dates. And any specific data sets or analyses that you're going to do by extra planned publication. For example, maybe a pharmacokinetics manuscript or HEOR taken from your large phase 3 program. And then obviously the last people in your integrated disclosure team, you need to be keeping records of your authors and your publication steering committees, but also the contributors to that disclosure team are no longer just the medical writer and the publication planner, but also the data disclosure specialist, probably regulatory affairs, probably patents, probably your public affairs group, compliance. There are a number of different people in all of this. It's moved from being a sort of a fairly discrete group to being a much more cross-company exercise. And of course you need consistency of information across all these different outlets. And I would propose that you, rather than having QC one document against another all the time, that you have a core results document, and you, depending on your company and the efficiency of your processes, deciding on whether that's final tables, figures and listings, and really final, not just sort of, oh well, these are the tables, figures and listings that we're going to use, and then changing them again 2 weeks later. I think you need to fix that, or fix, if you're fast, fix on a final clinical study report. And then that goes into everything else. So the data is the same in all the results summaries, the local registries, European Clinical Trial Register, clinicaltrials.gov, individual patient data, etc., your primary publication, your primary Congress abstract. So everything is tied together. I think there's some implications for those of us who write clinical trial manuscripts. You need to do some research first. If you're in an agency or even in a company, you need to be making contacts with your disclosure specialists and doing independent checks on the databases to find and be consistent with the data from that clinical trial, and also put it in context with what other clinical trials what other clinical trials on that product are already out there. You need to include or acknowledge all pre-specified outcomes in the manuscript. I mean, obviously you can't cover everything in every manuscript because there are space limitations, but you're going to have to acknowledge that there are others and that where they might be found, because the protocol is going to be out there. So you can't pretend that that these are the only outcomes. And obviously you clearly need to indicate any post hoc outcomes. You need to objectively report and explain your adverse events, particularly deaths, serious adverse events and other clinically relevant AEs in context. And there's a good publication from the MPIP group on that. The other thing is that you need to mention any amendments or temporary suspensions of the trial, because again that will be public on another database, so you can't ignore that in your clinical trial manuscript. You need to explain any discrepancies from the protocol and stats analysis plan, for example any post hoc analyses or differences in stats methods and differences between actual and planned sample size. And obviously include your NCT and UDRAP numbers. For librarians, archivists, there are implications for bibliographies, because at the in the past it tended to be you kept a bibliography of your child publications in journals and in congresses, but now you need to think about where else your information is public. So company websites, regulatory agency websites, disease-specific and patient organisation websites. And this is not just important from keeping a record internally, but also you need this because this is what you base your argument that the information is commercially confidential to the EMA. Because if it's already out, or already been publicised, and you say it's commercially confidential, they just turn around and laugh at you. So this is an important factor that needs to be considered. So the goalposts have moved, and no, the badger heads don't mean anything, but the goalposts have moved. So thank you very much.